Wyoming's budget session is one of the unique features of its state government. With the need of having a supermajority to introduce legislation, some bills would have a much more difficult time making their way through Congress. Today, we will be discussing the impact of the 66th Wyoming legislature on the 2023 Wyoming budget session. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the half-hour doc. It's been too long! My name is
Spencer is back. And hello, I am YuYu. I have been here when Spencer was gone. But first things first, congratulate Spencer on coming back to the podcast. Finally, he's not dead. I did not kick him off the show.
Let's just say it's been a shame. I'm ashamed of you. Why would you go out, replace me like that? It's unbelievable. That's sad. Admittedly, he did a better job than I do on this podcast.
For legal reasons, this was a joint decision. But anyway,
Adrian did a great job. Big shout out to him. Thank you for his cooperation. It was amazing. He was very funny. He is way better than I am. I think if I had to retire, he would probably be my replacement.
Wow. I don't know. It doesn't seem like you'll ever see Adrian ever again. Just stay tuned. Anyway, back to the budget session. This episode, as you may have known, is about the budget session. Yes, it's not necessarily like big current event news that's going on, but it is Wyoming news. And since we are catering to our Wyoming audience at this point, because that is our fan base, we're going to talk about Wyoming news because it is just as important as current news, especially if you are a citizen in Wyoming. It affects you in more ways than you know. So today you have me explaining the background about what the heck Wyoming Congress has been up to, and Spencer, the intern, telling you what the heck actually happened. Are you excited, Spencer?
Absolutely. And I would make a mention of this. It's probably more important than federal government, right? The things that happen in the state affect people's daily lives, right? It's not just Wyoming. We're talking like about Colorado. If people live in Colorado, if you live in Utah, California, for YuYu, those laws that pass are very important. Everything that is passed at the state level is way more important than anything that will be passed at the national level. With that being said, there is actually a really sad part to this whole thing. YuYu, who's your state rep? Exactly. Your state government.
Hey.
Whoa,
in my defense, I have not stayed in California for that long, but I will let Spencer continue to defend me.
So here's the thing. Most people don't know that, and that's really sad, actually. That's a big problem because the fact that your state government actually affects your life more than what happens at the federal level, and you don't know who your state rep is, that's a really big issue. And today we're going to kind of point out why it's important to know about what's happening at the state level. That way you have an understanding of, hey, is our state rep actually doing what they're supposed to? For example, I know that my state rep, and I've known this for a while, I know that my state representative is Representative Mark Baker. Hey, I live in House District 60. At the same time, my state senator is Senator Tom James. Now, for those of you who don't know, that is one of the more extreme people in the Senate. Actually, he is tied with Anthony Bouchard as the most extreme person. So we actually have, I'm actually in one of those districts that's very red. Actually, it hasn't been red for a while, but we'll talk about that later. The point is, you should know this because these people really do make a big effect on your life. And it's really sad that I can turn around and just, like, YuYu's a very smart person. She knows a lot about what's going on, okay? But it's very sad that I turn around and go, who's your state rep, right? And you don't know, right? And most people don't, okay? And so that's no target to YuYu, but that's just the honest truth, right? The one thing that we got asked a lot at the internship, and I know I'm rambling right away, but the one thing that we got asked at the internship, every person that came as a guest speaker to us said, who's your state rep? Because most people don't know. And that's really like sad. So this is an extremely important episode if you are in Wyoming. you absolutely have to listen to this. Well, you don't have to. I guess you have freedom of choice, but you should listen to this. This has a lot of good information, and you really need to start paying. I would argue that people should start paying more attention to what happens at the state level. Even the local level is really important. Actually, the way the system is built in the US, local government is the most important, state government is the second most, and the federal is the one you should care less about. But I guess we kind of forgot about that along the way. And that's kind of upsetting to me. Actually, you could probably find your state rep. There's like find your state rep websites out there. So you could probably Google that while I'm speaking through my segment. But we'll go ahead and start with you.
All right. Well, first of all, I don't technically live in California, so I'm not going to do that. But second of all, basically what Spencer is trying to tell you is federalism, everybody. That's our system. That's what we're talking about today, but specifically on the state level. And what he's trying to say when he says, oh, federal government stuff doesn't really matter, doesn't really affect you. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's more so that it doesn't really affect you on the individual level, or there's no immediate effects that you feel. But on the state level and on the local level, those are more immediate effects that you feel because it's closer to you. It is literally home. So that's basically why we think it's important to talk about. So before Spencer gives you a whole rundown about what happened in the budget session, I'm going to provide you some background information. Now, this is going to be fairly short because Spencer has the meat of the information. I'm just here. So think of this as a mini interview, but Spencer is my interviewee. I don't even know if that's the right word to say that, but okay. On the breakdown for the background information, every even year, there is a budget session, and every odd year, there is a general session. So because it is 2022 and an even year, this year is a budget session, and it started on February 14th, right on Valentine's Day. Budget sessions usually only last 20 legislative days compared to general sessions that last around 40. The reason being is that Wyoming senators and representatives work part-time and not full-time like bigger state representatives and senators do. And the only difference would just be they don't actually have a set office with a set crew to help them do everything because they're not there all of the time. They're only there part-time. But that does mean that they can talk to their constituents more, hang out with them on the down low, things like that. But the budget does not require a 2/3 vote to be introduced into the session. So that's just generally how much money they get. All the other bills will need a 2/3 vote to be considered during a budget session. The breakdown in the Senate and the House is, in the Senate, we currently have 28 Republicans and 2 Democrats. In the House, we have 51 Republicans, 7 Democrats, 1 independent, and 1 libertarian. And yes, it is a 30-60 breakdown in terms of how many are in the Senate, how many are in the House. As you may know from your government classes, the federal and state governments are on different levels and have different powers over different things. While the national government can decide a budget for themselves to work on for the whole US, they don't decide for the state level. So that's where state congresses convene to decide how they want to spend the money in their own state and where it's going to go. This budget session was working with Governor Mark Gordon's 2023-2024 budget, which will last for 2 years. The budget he proposed was $2.3 billion and is more than what was anticipated just because of the effects of the economy, COVID, all of the things that needed to be addressed. So $2.3 billion was more than they had thought that they were going to get, but it's still relatively small. So it was half the size of the 2010 budget, which is kind of saying a lot. Some of the $2.3 billion will go towards school funding for both higher level education, secondary education. So that'll be University of Wyoming and community colleges and general school districts in Wyoming. Some will go towards workers' compensation as they've been hit really hard during the pandemic because they had to be either let go or they couldn't work. But also some of that will go into a rainy day fund, which is just to stow away just in case Wyoming ever needs to pull out of that rainy day fund if we're having a rainy day, So other than that, Other bills were also discussed and that weren't really budget related, but I'll let Spencer talk about the majority of them as he wishes. But what I'm really mainly getting at was the redistricting bill that he constantly texted me about every single day that he was interning. But it was so interesting to hear about. I just know that he has more information on it and is more updated than I would be. So now that you know the general information about what was going on, what's in the budget, what the budget was necessarily addressing, I'm going to pass it off to Spencer to talk about things that weren't necessarily budget related.
All right. This session had three really big important bills. The first one was obviously the budget bill. That's one of the most important tasks in the budget session. The second one is ARPA funds. So for people that don't know, as a part of the American Rescue Plan Act, each state government received a certain amount of money that it can use. They were in the form of direct and indirect funds, and they had to be appropriated and spent accordingly. The state has until 2024 to spend them, and the projects are up to 2026 to be done. So one of the things that was being discussed was appropriations for the American Rescue Plan Act. The last one was redistricting. Redistricting is a constitutional obligation. In the state of Wyoming, we have to do redistricting as a part of the first budget session in the next decade. So what that means is 2020, it was the year that the census was done. Okay? 2022 is when redistricting occurs. 2030 will be the next census. 2032 will be the next redistricting. So that's kind of the process. It's the first budget session that redistricting has to be done in that decade. So that's kind of the big meat of what really was going on. We'll talk about those. I'm going to talk about those last because there were a couple of other bills that are really important and that are going to be good discussion points. All right, so there were three really big bills that were passed in this session that deserve the most talking about. The first one is the budget bill. The second one is the American Rescue Plan Act. And the last one is the redistricting bill. Each of these we'll talk about in depth. I want to talk about a few others first because they're really important for what was going on in the state. Let's start with a couple of the failed bills. The first one is, as many people heard about, we had a bill called the Fairness in Women's Sports Act. In essence, this was going to be a bill that was going to bar transgender women from competing in women's sports. And this was a big issue that came after a transgender woman broke a ton of world records in a women's sporting event. I can't remember which state it was in, but it really brought a lot of national attention and really sparked the debate of whether or not trans women should be participating in women's sports by, of course, a bunch of conservatives. The bill failed. The reason why it failed is because the Senate introduced the bill actually a day late. And by introduce, I mean it got into its first reading one day later than it should have. And because of that, I actually had an opportunity to talk with the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House was never notified about this. So he actually never introduced the legislation and just caused it to die. So you can thank the Speaker of the House for causing the bill to die if you are a very big advocate against that bill. So you can thank the Speaker of the House. Speaker Barlow did that pretty much for your end. The next one is banning critical race theory, which might come as a surprise to a lot of people that this bill died in the state of Wyoming. But there actually exists a philosophy called white fright. And basically what this is we have a state government or a state that has about 93% white population. And what that means is discussion of race is typically pretty minimal. So issues like banning critical race theory or anything relating to any kind of race have a very difficult time passing in our Congress. So in this state's history, I believe there's only been one equality bill ever passed. That just goes to show how difficult it is to pass these kinds of bills and on the same time to limit these kinds of discussions. So critical race theory was a big one that had a lot of hot topics on. It actually had a House bill and a Senate file on it. The House bill died, the Senate file passed through the Senate and then died back in the House. So the House just wasn't appreciative of the concept and they did not want to ban critical race theory. A couple of the bills that passed that should be discussed. The first one is abortion prohibition. So this was House Bill 92. And basically, it says in a nutshell that the state of Wyoming is going to 100% prohibit abortion after, I don't remember how many weeks, but it just said it will completely remove abortion, but it has to be after the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. So if that was to ever happen, then this law goes into effect. Now, it hasn't been signed by the governor yet, so I don't actually know whether or not this will be implemented. I assume the governor will veto this. Just kind of thinking reasonably, we have a moderate governor in the state of Wyoming. And the big thing about this law or about this discussion, go back to our third episode. I don't really need to explain further. We discussed about what we think about the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. Next, Senate File 68. This is decentralized autonomous organizations and its amendments to this. They're also referred to as DAOs. This is blockchain bill. Basically, if you don't know, the state of Wyoming has a type of organization called a DAO, and it is the first ever implemented in the world. We implemented it in 2021, and it is a concept in which an organization can be fully ran on a blockchain. But because we have a concept where we can build organizations that run autonomously, where there is no hierarchy, there's no CEO. There might be a CEO, but the CEO gets the same vote as an employee. The fact that we have this kind of organization has brought a lot of attention to Wyoming. We have, in essence, we've actually seen 130 companies register as DAOs in the state of Wyoming since 2021. The big thing that's important to get here is this bill has a tremendous impact on the state's economy. It's bringing in business, essentially amending it to make sure that businesses will stay with Wyoming and make it easier for them to become developed. So we're anticipating another amendments to this to DAOs in the next year or two. But just for the most part, be understanding that the state of Wyoming is really trying to diversify its economy, and it's diversifying it through the advancement of blockchain technology. And that brings into Senate File 106, which is the Wyoming Stable Token Act. For those of you who aren't aware, Wyoming just passed a law that says that we are implementing the first state-sponsored stable token, or virtual currency, in essence. So now we actually have our own virtual currency. You can exchange it for $1. So you go to the Secretary of State, or you go to the Treasurer, as a matter of fact, and you exchange $1 and you would get one stable token. And you should, in essence, be able to transact with it, or you can hold on to it, just like any other form of currency. That was a pretty fast rundown. You can read through more of those. I will have every single one of those bills linked in the description. Next, let's talk about redistricting. Okay, redistricting is a constitutional obligation in the United States. You have to do redistricting, and there is a boatload of laws. It's also written in the U.S. Constitution. It's also written in our state's constitution. So, in essence, we have to do redistricting in the first budget session of the new decade. So it's always 2022, it will be 2032 next time, and 2042, etc. We had redistricting at a 62-31. What that means is there's 62 House districts and 31 Senate districts. This is the first time it's increased since 1992, which is a really important point because that means that we have more representation now. And where the counties that are getting more representation, Natrona and Laramie County. That means that our more populous cities, Casper and Cheyenne, have grown in population. And that's a really important part because, well, if redistricting is going this way, if we have to increase the amount of districts we have, that also means that there's a higher chance that this state is going to start turning blue. A more population actually increases the chance of Democratic voters. So that's something that's really important to understand, that we may actually start to really shift to Democrat. It's going to take a very long time for that to happen, but there is a probability that we need to pay attention to the next election because this next election could actually see these two big cities of Casper and Cheyenne have some more blue in them. Next up, we have the American Rescue Plan Act. As a part of ARPA, the state of Wyoming received direct and indirect funds, which basically means that we have funds that we have to spend on different kinds of projects because of basically the bailouts from the COVID issue. Okay, so we've got a lot of money that we have to spend. The big deal is we're spending that money. I'm not going to say more. Okay. Senate File 67, on the other hand, was also an important one, where we had the discussion of state-funded capital construction. This basically means that we are going to construct different capital ideas, one of which I think was the development of a rodeo in Cheyenne. There's going to be a new place for it, or a brand new form of it, because Cheyenne wants to have its own rodeo. So they do a couple of things like that. That is the super fast breakdown of a lot of different bills. If you want to know anything more about that, they're all in the description. Hey, I know that was a very fast breakdown. Hey, but we don't have time to go through all of those, right, YuYu?
Yeah, no. It's gonna be like 2-hour podcast instead of half-hour podcast.
Early advertising, though, if you have questions, DM me on Instagram. Link in the description.
Yeah, because apparently none of you listened to the outro, and I'm so sad. Great segue to the questions. Thank you to Spencer for kind of just rehashing everything that is important and that we should be taking a look at as Wyoming citizens. But now it does get to the bigger, broader Extemp questions that do relate to kind of like national policy, but also very relatable to like how Wyoming is handling it. So the first one is partisan redistricting a threat to American democracy? And to my understanding, partisan redistricting is just gerrymandering. So yeah, let's talk about it. Spencer, what are your thoughts?
Well, redistricting and gerrymandering are the exact same thing. Yeah, they're just different terminologies, or they're just different ways of saying the same thing, right? Partisan redistricting, what that means is, oh God, how do I explain this in a way that is so easy to understand? Partisan redistricting is like this, okay? There exists, we talked about this actually in episode 25. There's two types of districts that you can have. You can have what's called a safe district, and you can have what's called a competitive district. Okay? A competitive district is one that can flip between Republican and Democrat, and a partisan district, or excuse me, a safe district is one that is solid, that will only be Republican or that will only be Democrat. So when they do redistricting, they try to draw the lines in a way that can either make districts competitive or safe. Partisan redistricting is really trying to benefit your party, right? Now, that can happen in a couple of ways. The first one is by building safe districts that will 100% secure your seat. Okay. And that is what's been happening this year, is we see a lot of safe districts in multiple states. It happened in Wyoming with the 62 plan, the 6231 was built to be primarily safe districts. A lot of the Democratic districts in Teton County and Albany, those are the two big ones, remained to be Democrat, and very heavily so. So that's kind of the idea. And then they try to promote the best they can for Republicans in this state. Other states will put those safe districts for Republicans, and then they will do Democratic districts that are now competitive. So they will try to get them to flip to Republican so Republicans can increase the amount of seats that they have in their state. That's the idea behind it. So is that a threat to democracy? Oh boy, I don't want to like really go because I could really go complicated here. The short answer is yes. From a very deep political science point of view, actually the answer is no. So here's why. It's a common discussion that redistricting leads to polarization. Okay. By doing this, we tend to be more polarized. Thus, increasing polarization obviously it leads to more crazies like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or some people say AOC. It really depends on how you view that, right? But it does lead to more extremes. That's what people say. That's not true. Okay, redistricting has a very small effect on polarization. And that effect is about we look, from what I understand and what we discussed about in one of my classes, it's about 10 to 15 points. And if you think that sounds like a lot, comparatively speaking, that's really not. When you look at all of the factors that have caused polarization, gerrymandering is very low on that list. It's not really that big of a threat, okay? But has it caused some of those other problems to have occurred? Maybe. And that's where you could say yes, right? Is saying that gerrymandering has led to more, or partisan redistricting has led to those households to only vote Republican or Democrat and continuously to vote Republican or Democrat over time, which only makes them become more extreme, which causes the people who are voting to become more extreme, which leads to more extreme legislators, which leads to more extreme bills being passed, which leads to less bipartisanship, which leads to them creating more redistricting problems, etc. So if you want to think of it as a chain effect, as an impact on the voters, that's the way to say yes. Otherwise, the answer to this is actually a solid no. The amount of effect that redistricting has on polarization in general is very minimal.
Yeah, and I think like most of my thoughts about gerrymandering were already revealed like in episode 25 where we talked about that. But in terms of like this question of is partisan redistricting a threat to American democracy, I think you can make the argument most convincingly for a yes, because that's just the common critique of gerrymandering in general. Like when you're taught this in high school, when you hear about other people like complaining about gerrymandering, it is that it is harmful to democracy because people are not getting their vote. And it seems like the people who live within those districts that are not necessarily voting for that representative to be their representative, that they're not getting a fair vote, especially if it's a safe district, because then they get outvoted. However, I don't necessarily know if it is like that big of a threat to American democracy, if it is a threat. And that's just because I think the benefits that we mainly talked about with gerrymandering is that then the idea is representatives don't necessarily have to worry about campaigning as much if they're in a safe district, in which then they can dedicate more time to, introducing legislation, writing legislation, talking to constituents and things like that, rather than like worrying about, their campaign and if they're going to be voted in, like if they're going to stay in their seat basically in the next term. With competitive districts, it's harder. Well, it's just harder in general because it is competitive and you don't know per se if you're going to stay or if you're going to be voted out. And that draws concern for whether now this representative is spending more time and money, effort into campaigning so that they can win their seat again, or if they're focusing their time, or if they have enough time to like focus on more important things like bills and stuff like that. The actual way that this pans out, I'm not too aware of, but I know that these are the arguments that are made on both sides, just on like the general level.
Yeah, I think for the most part, political science research says that it's not a
Yeah.
threat to democracy. And that's just really really in-depth view of it. And there's actually a really good book that actually hit on this point pretty lightly. It's called It's Even Worse Than It Looks is the name of the book. Maybe it's even worse than it is. I don't remember the full name of the book, but it'll be in the description. But it basically says that gerrymandering doesn't have that big of effect, and you can't basically point your finger at it and say this is really that big of a deal. Now, is there better solutions to what's going on? Yes. Okay, but let's throw out the most common one, right? And that most common one is independent commissions. Okay, independent commissions, and that's really where this question is going to kind of push you, is to make this conclusion that independent commissions are really good. And that's usually where these questions go. That's not true. Okay, independent commissions are just as bad. If not, they can sometimes be worse than the current system of redistricting. And that's because, well, who appoints them? And those people can just be Republicans and Democrats too. It's not nonpartisan, right? It's something that actually affects you personally. And that's something that I heard a lot of legislators say at the session, right? Drawing this back to Wyoming, is it's something that affects me personally. It's a big deal, right? Redistricting works when nobody wins. That is the key phrase of this episode, right? Our redistricting bill in this state, everybody was upset with it, which is good. That means it's successful, right? That means we did a very good job with redistricting. That is the thing that we have to understand. So if everybody's upset with it, we did a good job. Okay, if everybody's happy with it, we're screwed. Okay, that's really the way that this kind of bill that this bill works. So I think it really does depend on like the type of redistricting we're talking about. Let's be fair, the best way to do this and to do voting, and to propose a solution here, maybe the best way to do voting to House districts and Senate districts would be by percentage of votes. So you have, let's say in the state of Wyoming, we're a pretty red state. So let's say we have 70% people voting on the Republican Party and 30% of the people voting Democratic. That's very generous to the Democrats, but we'll just say that. Okay. The way that should work then is the Republican Party, the Republican Party of Wyoming, would appoint people all across the state or from one part of the state, it doesn't matter, to 70% of the seats. And then the Wyoming Democratic Party would appoint the last 30%. That's the way to make that fair. Okay? And that makes it easy to switch the government and actually cause more democratic representation in the state. So it really depends on how you view that, but just know that independent commissions are just as bad, if not worse, than the current system of redistricting. I know I think we talked about this a while back. California has an independent commission, if I'm not mistaken. And
I cannot tell you because I have not lived there that long, but sure, we'll go with that.
Actually, I might double check that while you give your rebuttal or whatever you'll do here. But I think California has an independent commission. And just to show you, it's still pretty dang blue.
I don't know. Like either way, independent condition yeah, either way, I think it's doesn't matter like as much as people generally tend to make it. Like, yes, it does affect like what representative is being voted to represent what, but there's also usually a reason that it is like there's a reason why gerrymandering happens. And we should probably look into those reasons rather than kind of just like maybe thinking about doing something else. While I agree that it's not the perfect system, like all systems are at the moment, but it is something that does happen. And having conversation around that is really important just to bring awareness into how it actually affects everything and how it manifests itself into politics. But I don't think I have anything else to add to this question.
I don't have anything else either. Just remember, redistricting works when nobody's happy. Let's move on to the next question. It's true. It is very true. Maybe my most motivational statement of all time. All right, next question. Are recent efforts to purge critical race theory from schools unconstitutional? All right, this is maybe an important thing to discuss, is what is critical race theory? Okay, and I want to start here for a big reason, and then I'll lead it to you. And the reason why is because nobody knows what critical race theory actually means. And that is a really important point here, right? I should probably find the John Oliver discussion, because John Oliver did a very good job of explaining what critical race theory is. If you don't know, he is the host of Last Week Tonight. He's a comedian, very funny, in my opinion. And he had a whole discussion about critical race theory. And to be fair, it's really funny because Tucker Carlson, right, a Fox News anchor that many people are very well aware of, had somebody on to discuss banning critical race theory. And he literally said on television, Tucker Carlson did, he said, I don't even know what you're talking about, but I hate it. Right on television, okay? It's blatantly obvious. You can find the clip of it. It's also in the John Oliver skit that's going to be in the description. So if you want to see it, there you go. Here's the point. Okay, critical race theory, what it really means is, in the easiest discussion, is it is a neutral, or it is a discussion about a specific race during a specific period of time. And what would happen is, if you ban critical race theory from being discussed, is it doesn't necessarily eliminate this discussion. Instead, it provides a neutral playing field. The best way, prior to the podcast, you and I, we talked about a way to discuss this best would be the Holocaust. And this was an example provided in the Wyoming legislature, where Representative Schwartz, who is a Jewish person, shot down the bill because it was going to provide a neutral view of the Holocaust. And that's really what it's going to do. Banning critical race theory is providing a neutral view of different events that have happened in history or that are currently happening. So in terms of the Holocaust, for example, it's not just the Jews have been attacked. I mean, that's a very broad explanation, but obviously we all know it's more than that. But it's Germany's reasoning, Germany's motive, why Germany might have thought it was good, and it's going to provide that neutral stance. And that's the biggest misconception about critical race theory that people don't really get, is banning critical race theory does not eliminate what's being discussed now. It really just provides a neutral playing ground. Anyway, that's to explain it. I know critical race theory is confusing.
I think I want to add on to that. I agree with some of the things that you talk about in terms of how to define critical race theory, but it is more than just studying a certain race at a certain time. Critical race theory in itself states that race is a social construct. And what it does is it studies how that racial construct has implemented itself into society and how it affects everyday life. So that is what critical race theory is. Opponents to critical race theory, people who want to ban that from schools or purge that from education, however you want to phrase that, they don't like the idea that race is a social construct. For some of them, it is that race is biological, and race is a well-known thing that is biological in our DNA. It's something that separates us. But critical race theory states that no, race is not biological. We are all people. It's just the way that we have identified races and the way that we have kind of grouped them together is a social construct that needs to be studied and understood why it exists. That is what critical race theory is. Now, in terms of getting to the question of whether this critical race theory is unconstitutional, I would say that it's critical race theory in itself is not unconstitutional. The way that the question is phrasing, are recent efforts to purge critical race theory from schools unconstitutional? Then I would answer, yes, it is unconstitutional, because you could talk about it through multiple aspects, but the easiest way to kind of say that it is unconstitutional is that it is like freedom of speech. It's free expression, free ideology that should be like expressed and is expressed by many people. And so banning critical race theory from schools is taking away that freedom of speech and freedom of what we can learn and consume. However, some people might argue that like there is certain things that are already banned in schools. So like you can't particularly learn about one thing, but you can't say one thing, but then you can say another things. So for example, I think like what was the famous court case again, where they banned symbols of hate crime, but then they also banned things that like were protesting the Vietnam War in schools. Yes, that happened, but in terms of like just banning a whole ideology outright is different than just banning those certain instances that have happened in school. So I would say that it is unconstitutional to purge them from schools because, it's not necessarily harmful. It doesn't promote any hate speech. It doesn't promote anything that's like harmful in a way that it's going to cause riots or it's going to cause like lots of violence to pursue just by introducing critical race theory. And so I don't think there are grounds to make it constitutional to ban critical race theory in school. So it is unconstitutional to ban them in school. That's my thought.
I think that's an interesting answer. I like the way you just define critical race theory, right? Obviously, as I came across though, remember that if we're purging this or if we're banning this per se, right? That social construct is not really entirely eliminated. Okay. And that's kind of the point that we're getting here. If you look through the critical race theory bill, for example, that's provided in Wyoming, right? While it's still horrible, and I personally believe that we shouldn't ban critical race theory. I'm gonna make that note now. But when you really look through that bill, it wasn't gonna do it's more gonna provide that neutral playing ground. And I think that that's really what a lot of people think of when this gets banned, right? Is it's not necessarily I wouldn't say it eliminates the social construct entirely. Okay, I just don't really see that being eliminated. Rather, it's going to take that social construct, and what you're going to see happen is teachers will start providing that opposite side, okay? And that will be started to be provided in those textbooks, right? So you will see both sides of the argument, and that's really what's going to happen. And that's what Representative Andy Schwartz was saying when he was explaining why he doesn't support that bill is the Holocaust will be viewed on a neutral playing ground, right? Should the Holocaust be viewed on a neutral playing ground? No, it probably should be viewed as the fact of Jewish people were targeted by the Germans, right? And I think that's generally a universal agreement is that shouldn't that I mean, is it important to discuss about why Germany had those motives? Maybe. There's some discussion worth having, right? But with that being said, does it really take away that social construct? Okay? And that's where this gets really tricky and very confusing. If you want me to be fully honest with you. So I think that the answer to this question is probably no. Okay? And the reason why I stand with that is, and I know it's a white man saying no, okay, but here's really the reason why I think it's no. I don't think that this actually violates the 13th Amendment. And if it's really critical race theory being put on a neutral ground and it's being viewed in this form of we're still going to discuss what's happened and the impacts of it, then then what's going on is not being eliminated. I don't think that freedom of speech is going away. I get the idea, right? I think that it's just a bad idea in general to ban this because there's really not a good point to like the big discussion that we've had that I've had before is trying to avoid color blindness. If you've watched a podcast that I've had with Lyle, right? I talked about avoiding colorblindness as something that's really important, right? We need to be able to view that side so we understand that side better, right? And you view the impacts of what's happened with people because that really does help you out quite, that helps you understand what they've been through, right? And a really good way to look at that is here I am being a white cisgender straight man, right? And literally zooming a Asian American. Okay? And it's important to understand like the history and what's going on with Asian Americans in the United States. It's actually very important because if I was just to ignore that, I'd be colorblind and not understand the purpose. Okay, that's a general description of Michelle Alexander theory. But the problem here is if this is being viewed in a neutral manner, that doesn't take that discussion away. Instead, it takes away, instead, it probably limits it a lot more, but also provides the alternative side, which makes me believe that it still functions within constitutional obligations and the constitutional amendments that we have. I'm ready to hear you just tear me.
I'm gonna bringing in critical race theory to this discussion. You have to view the reason and who the proponents or the opponents are to critical race theory being taught in schools. In that conversation, you tend to understand that these are people in positions of power. And at the moment, our politicians are usually white males in power. But generally speaking, it is the Republican side of the party that tends to want to ban critical race theory. That's why Spencer said it's surprising that this didn't pass. But in conversation with that, it gives it a new light in how banning critical race theory can cause a lot of negative harms, even if the bill itself doesn't exactly say that it's going to end these conversations. So the way that I'm going to explain this as easy and as less convoluted as I can is just when you are thinking about purging critical race theory being taught in schools, it is not in the conversation that it's just going to be neutral and we're going to bring both sides onto the table. It's that you're taking these racial structures out of the equation. That's what's happening when you are banning critical race theories in schools. It is not that, oh, everything is going to be neutral because we're going to view both sides of the spectrum. It is mostly we're going to view this in a very colorblind way because that is how people know to discuss things neutrally without bringing in race. And when you get rid of that racial construct, it is an ideology that you are completely dismissing in schools. And so that is unconstitutional. The way that the bills are phrased to be constitutional are very vague in terms of how you can talk about gender in schools, how you can talk about race in schools, and how you can talk about other things in schools. It is vague for a reason, but because it is vague, it can also be exploited in a very negative way, in which it necessarily means that you just take race out of the conversation and you forget about a very important factor that affects a lot of the decisions that were made in history and a lot of the reasons why the structures that exist today do exist and why we see a lot of the things that we do see in news with like the Black Lives Matter movement, with the hate crimes against the Asian American community and things like that. And so I'm both saying that it is unconstitutional to ban this in schools and that it is a very important conversation that we need to have just generally to understand kind of the world we live in. And there's nothing wrong with understanding the world we live in. And I think there's a lot of fear when it comes to trying to understand the world we live in because it feels like we're assigning blame to a particular person. But critical race theory does not technically assign blame. It just makes you aware of what is going on and why it's going on. And that's kind of the important thing that I want to push today, is that it's not assigning blame. It is not like taking white people and calling them horrible and bad. It's just studying the ways that other races have been oppressed. And in terms of like the United States, it's just how these social structures still continue into everyday life and why they still exist today. And being aware of that is being understanding of everything that kind of affects our lives and affects daily lives.
I agree with everything you said. Okay. There's just a really big problem with this question. And I think this question is a very good discussion, and it probably does need to be had. But the issue is what can be taught in schools under the Constitution, right? The the question is asking if purging this is unconstitutional. And that's where I'm kind of stuck is I don't think that there is a constitutional amendment that says that we can't bar it. And that's really where that discussion is, right? Is sure, we can talk about discussing CRT as a point of freedom of speech, right? But then comes this question of the question that does really exist of isn't the other side also freedom of speech, right? And that's really that big troubling part here. And that's kind of the issue that's really struggling for me here is it's really the phrase unconstitutional in this question. I don't actually think that there is an amendment that is specific towards schools in this aspect of what can and can't be taught. And that's kind of the problem that I've got here with the question and why I think it's more of a no is it's not that I think we should ban or purge this. That's not a good idea. It's the fact of I don't think that there is a constitutional obligation that says schools must teach it this way. And that's the problem that I see with this question is if schools can't if schools have to teach a specific way and that's written in the US Constitution, right? Then that I see that being a yes. Okay. It's just the phrase unconstitutional is really what throws me off with this question and why I don't believe that this is an absolute yes. It it has to be a no. I just don't see how a yes can be on it.
Two things. First, it doesn't get rid of the other side. You do study the other side and why it ends up happening. It's like you do have to understand the other side's ideology in order to understand how that manifests in their actions. Secondly, I would say it is still unconstitutional on the basis of free speech. Because, like, yes, there's not a specific set of rules of what you have to teach in schools listed in the Constitution. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can restrict what you teach. Like, freedom of speech is giving you freedom to, like talk about what you want to talk about and to like believe in what you want to believe in and preach what you want to preach. It only is barred in times when it is hate speech, when it is something that is violent and something that like could cause crime. I don't think critical race theory falls in any of those categories. So there should not be a case that critical race theory should be purged and that would be constitutional because it is unconstitutional to do that because then you're restricting speech for no reason. Besides, you don't want it to be taught. And I'm sure there are like well enunciated arguments against teaching critical race theories in schools that people have, but I don't think that necessitates that it is constitutional to ban them in schools. So it shouldn't be unconstitutional.
I think there's one last thing I've got here. This has been a very good discussion, and I think that we've brought a lot to the table because this is a good question. I think that this would be a great question for somebody to pick an Extemp, as we've been discussing back and forth here. Let's take this maybe a step backwards for a minute. Okay, going back all the way to 2001. Okay, the No Child Left Behind Act. Here's what this act really did, and what we know it did is this is the act that created the really big problems with standardized testing. And the reason why that's a big deal is that created something in which teachers have an obligation to teach basically to the test. Okay, and that's a discussion that's talked about very little. Okay? The reason why standardized testing people don't like it is because teachers have to teach to the test so they can retain their credibility, right? In itself, that limits the discussion of educational topics, doesn't it not? So the point that I'm making here is, while I think that banning critical race theory is bad and we shouldn't do this, right? If it was truly unconstitutional, then this issue here, the one that happened 21 years ago, is also unconstitutional because we have limited what we are being taught in schools based off of this one singular bill.
Yeah, like I would agree with you. I think it's unconstitutional. But like I also think the difference with standardized testing compared to purging critical race theories in schools is that standardized testing does not specify that you have to teach to the test. Whereas purging critical race theories in schools specifies what you are restricting, and that is unconstitutional. I mean, I still don't like the standardized testing, and if it is declared unconstitutional, I would not be opposed to that. But I think there is a difference in these two comparisons. Like standardized testing doesn't necessarily mean that you are like constraining everything exactly to the test, because that's not what it is. That's not what the bill is. But the bills that would purge critical race theories in schools do specify that there's a certain way that you have to teach about gender, and there's a certain way that you have to teach about race, in which it manifests itself into saying you cannot talk about them. And that is what is unconstitutional. And that is why I stand by my answer.
Good discussion. We want to hear your discussion in our DMs. It'd be great to hear what you guys have to think, because this has been a good discussion. I think that there's a lot to take away from here, from both sides. And I think we did a really good job at presenting both sides of the argument. Once again, we're both advocates. Don't ban critical race theory. That's dumb. Okay. Once again, the question here was whether or not it's unconstitutional. And I think if this question was, should states ban critical race theory, we would both be like, heck no. Like we both firmly disagree with that. This was a good question though, and really a worthwhile one to discuss is whether or not it's actually constitutional. But I think that wraps up the episode really nicely, don't you, YuYu?
I do, Spencer. So everybody else, let us know how you did. Let us know if you got the one. If not, that's okay. Let us know. Just anyway, just like DM us. Just like tell us how you did, Tell us how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either me or Spencer. We're always available on our social media most of the time after midnight. That's our office hours. But anyway, make sure to follow our socials. Make sure to follow us on Instagram, Half Hour Extemp Podcast, and on our Twitter at the same handle. Don't forget to hit the red subscribe button on our YouTube page. If you're not on the YouTube page, please just subscribe anyway. And also ring the bell so that you have notifications to whenever we post episodes. Because we post on YouTube earlier than we post on OneCloud. But also support OneCloud too. As always, thank you so much for supporting us. Thank you so much for listening. We love you all. And thumbs up. Kind of lonely people with no friends.
Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you all later.